Dear church, let's talk about the burial of Jesus. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. As always, I'm your host, Chris McCurley, joined by a friend, Adam Faughn from Paducah, Kentucky. Adam, thank you for being on today.
Well, it's great to be with you. I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. Adam and I met probably, 10, 15 years ago. A mutual friend introduced us. I was doing a book on preaching, and you were highly recommended, and I'm glad that you were, because you did a great job in Preach Better, Fit for the Pulpit. Appreciate you so much contributing to those works. And then also the work that you're doing there in Kentucky. I appreciate everything that you do and contribute to the kingdom. You are definitely someone that I admire and value as a friend. And for those of us who are watching or listening that may not know you, tell us a little bit about you, about your family, and kind of the work that you're doing there.
I appreciate that. And I'm married to the former Leah Moon, and that last name they recognize may hit some people. Her brother is Jason Moon. He preaches now in Boone, North Carolina. I preach for the Central Church of Christ in Paducah, Kentucky. My dad actually preached at Central for a number of years. I didn't follow him. I always said I'd never follow my dad. There was one preacher between the two of us. He is one of my elders. Appreciate that a great deal. Love that relationship, and some of us in our family also do things together online. A Legacy of Faith. Some people may have heard of that. Dad and my mom and my sister and myself and Leah, my wife Leah, all work together on that, producing blog posts and podcasts and whatever we can think of to do any day of the week, and just try to encourage people, encourage families, and just try to strengthen the kingdom a little bit.
Yeah, and it's all good work. I appreciate your dad so much. Your mom actually wrote a chapter in a book I did on elders' wives, and both of them such bulwarks of faith. Appreciate them so much. Funny story. We were all eating at a catfish place in Jackson during Freed Hardeman lectureship, and I'm sitting with Ralph Gilmore, Jeff Jenkins, and you're at another table with your family, because your whole family takes up a whole section of the restaurant, and your son, who is like 6'10". I mean, the guy, he's may not be that tall, but he's really tall. Turner. Anyway, he's sitting at the other table. I said, Turner, hey, we didn't have our food yet. He had his food. I said, hey, can I have some shrimp? And he throws me some shrimp. Hits Jeff Jenkins in the shoulder. Jeff's wondering what's going on, and you're livid. You're about to come unglued on him. And I said, whoa. I did this. This is all my fault. But I should have let that go and see how much trouble he could have gotten into, right?
Yeah, we live close enough to Lambert's. I guess he thought you could just throw anything for food. So.
Exactly. Hey, you preached on a topic recently that I just, I don't hear a whole lot talked about. I mean, when we talk about Jesus's life, we typically talk about his ministry. We talk about his death, burial, and resurrection as part of the gospel, and of course focus heavily on the resurrection, which we should. But we don't talk so much, or at least I don't hear as much talked about the burial of Jesus. And, so you piqued my interest with this sermon, and I wanted to have you on to talk about it. The burial of Jesus, talk a little bit about just a 30,000-foot view of how you tackled that and what kind of got you started on that topic and preaching it.
Well, the easy answer is that our youth and family minister, Noah Davis, he and I came to our elders actually in the middle of 2022 and asked them if we could preach through the book of Mark, but take a long time to do it, take a couple of years actually to do it, and not every Sunday. And as you know, Chris, if you commit to preaching through a text, you commit to preaching through the text. You can't go, I want to preach that particular section. So over the course of about 23 months, we preached, I believe it was 65 sermons through the book of Mark. And so when you get to the cross, the next thing is the burial, and we weren't going to skip that and act like it wasn't there, but we also weren't going to just plug it into the crucifixion or the resurrection. We're going to let it stand alone as a section of Scripture. And like you, I'm not sure I'd ever heard a full sermon on the burial. It's mentioned, 1 Corinthians 15, the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, but to actually take 30 minutes and dive into that and present that, I'm not sure I'd ever heard that done. And I love the challenge of it. And so that's really where it came from, was I forced myself into doing it by committing to preach through a book of the Bible.
I've done that before, where you pick a topic or a series and you're going through and you're like, why did I do this? This is, So dig into the sermon a little bit. So you're presenting this, and I know that you talked about at first, respect, and you talk about request, you talk about release. The conclusion's really where I want to wrap this up, and I'm excited to get to that because I love your conclusion. But first, talk about kind of how you divided it out and where you started, and the journey that you took the audience on to get to where you're going.
Yeah, I'm not great at it, but I try to be an expository preacher when I can be. And of course, this was just straight through the end of Mark chapter 15. And so we spent a little bit of time on Joseph of Arimathea. And one of the interesting things about him in that text, we were preaching through Mark, by the way. And so that's the text I used for the most part. Of course, you draw some other things from Matthew and Luke more specifically, but it's remarkably how much is revealed about him in very short phrases. But it doesn't just say, there's this guy named Joseph. I mean, we learn he's part of the council, the Sanhedrin. We learn from prophecy, Isaiah 53, and also from the gospel records, he was wealthy. And so he had connections. He was able to go to Pilate and make this request. We don't know if that's because he was part of the Sanhedrin or because of his wealth or for some other reason. But, not everybody could just walk up to Pilate and say, hey, can I have this body, or send a message that way? So he had connections as well. And I had to admit in the sermon when I was dealing with him, he fascinates me, but he also confuses me, because earlier in Mark, the text will tell us that all of the council consented to have Jesus put to death. But then Matthew will tell us that Joseph of Arimathea was a secret disciple. And so I don't know the answer. That's one of those times as a preacher, you just have to admit, I don't know, and so that was part of the sermon, was just, digging into this man, these little details. And the point I want to get across to people in that part of the sermon really was just the humanity of everyone involved in the ministry of Jesus, but here specifically, the burial of Jesus. These were real people. They're as confusing as we are. And so that was part of the sermon.
One of the things that as I'm listening to that lesson, one of the things that stuck out to me is, what the body must have been like, what the condition it would have been. Now, I'm playing off of the Passion movie, right, Mel Gibson?
Yeah.
I mean, because that was the first movie I saw that really put it into a clearer focus of this was brutal, right?
Exactly.
And whether it was that bad or not, I tend to believe it was probably as bad or worse. And so he's taking this body, which would have been mutilated, and the fact that he volunteered to do that, requested, I should say, to do that. You think about, you said the courage that he would have had to go to Pilate and make that request, and just all of that I've never really thought about. I mean, you bring up really interesting points. Never really thought of that. And I'm sure that's something that you were wrestling with too as you were doing this, right?
Yeah. You go to Isaiah, I believe it's the end of chapter 52, that, prophecy in 53, as we think of it, really begins back in 52. You've got that phrase about Jesus by prophetic speaking there, that he was marred beyond human semblance. That's one of those phrases I can't get out of my mind when I think of the cross. And when we preached through the cross section of it, that's one of the things I tried to mention was whatever you've pictured, it was worse than that. Because again, Passion of the Christ or whatever play you've seen or whatever, they still have to sanitize it to some degree to make it where, kids can accept it and everything else. Jesus' body was destroyed. Obviously not a bone was broken, but the outer form was just destroyed. And so for Joseph to take that body and show respect, he doesn't just bring, but he buys a new linen shroud. I mean, and I don't say this to be funny, but why would you waste a linen shroud on a body that's just destroyed? I mean, and
exactly.
That cloth is going to be completely ruined. But he didn't care. He wanted to do what he could do in that moment to show some level of respect. And I have admiration. Again, I'm confused by him, but in those actions, I have admiration for him, what he was willing to do. As the Sabbath was nearing, they had to do this very quickly, get Jesus in the tomb, or at least take care of the body to some degree, because you have the Sabbath coming, you have the feast coming. And so just in what seems like a very, very condensed amount of time, they take care of this, again, just destroyed body because they respect and love Jesus that much.
Yeah, growing up, we had, being Catholic, we had crucifixes everywhere, right? That was a big part of the Catholic faith and still is. And most, if not all, of the crucifixes that I saw or possessed, there was a drop of blood here, a drop of blood here, a drop of blood on the feet, and maybe a drop of blood coming out the side. And I've always thought, wow, we missed it on that one, right? I mean, the brutality of this and the fact that this man was willing to take care of that body. And you also mentioned in the sermon about how Pilate was, surprised that Jesus had already died, which you say alludes to the cruelty of the crucifixion. Talk a little bit about that. Once Joseph takes the body, there's a release there of Pilate allowing him to have the body, and then what takes place from that point?
Well, I mean, like you said, the fact that he was surprised Jesus had already died. There are historical records of people staying on crosses for days and in some cases weeks. And there's a phrase that there's probably a better way of wording it, but you've probably used this before too, Chris. The Romans perfected crucifixion, and that's a very sadistic perfection. Yeah, it's a very bad thing to perfect. But the point of it was to obviously the person was going to die, but they wanted to show their show Rome's power. You are not in charge here. Rome is in charge here. And so if that meant keeping that person alive for a few days or even longer on the cross, that's what they were going to do. But Jesus, of course, had been through so much, and even beyond that, just by way of prophecy and fulfillment, this is when he was supposed to die, to be the Passover lamb, to die between the twilights, to use that Old Testament phrase. And so that's when he would die. But Pilate, again, a confusing figure. Because Pilate would be an interesting psychological study.
I thought the same thing. Yes,
because you sometimes read commentators and was Pilate repenting when he wrote this is Jesus, the King of the Jews? Was he repenting when he released the body? I don't know, and frankly, I don't think he was. Right. But I do think that he understood that something different was true about this in his view, man who had died. And so to allow the body to be released, not to a family member, but to just someone he knew, says something about, Pilate having at least some level of a heart to release the body. And then, of course, the body's taken as much as they can do very, very rapidly to wrap it in a lidded shroud and place it in a new tomb, which I love that Joseph didn't think this was a waste of a new tomb. He didn't say, well, I meant this for me. I meant this for my wife or whomever. This is supposed to be for my family. No, this is something I can do. The sermon title was Respect for the Rabbi. And really it came more from that part of it, that this was his teacher. This wasn't his wife. This wasn't his parents. This wasn't himself. But this wasn't a waste to Joseph to place that body inside that new tomb. And again, Joseph is a confusing character, but I appreciate and admire a lot of what he does, and that's one of the biggest ones.
Yeah, and you said something there that I have often thought about is, is Pilate somewhat remorseful here? Is he feeling guilt? Is this his way of somewhat trying to smooth it over or soothe his conscience by saying, I can at least do this much, right? Mm-hmm. And allow Joseph to have the body, and of course the signage. I agree with you. I don't know that I could land firmly either way, but it is a case study. You could take those two characters and do a lot of work in trying to come up with a lesson, and then at the end of it say, I don't know.
That's right.
It comes down to who in the world knows, but it does show that there at least is this sense among the people, even those who despise Jesus, that he was more than just some regular character, right? That there was something there that they sensed, at least on Pilate's side, and then of course with Joseph. What was the biggest eye opener for you? I know as a preacher, I love to do sermons where I learn all the way through it as much as I'm trying to teach, right? So what's the biggest thing that stood out to you when you were doing this lesson that just hit you between the eyes?
We've already talked about it. It was the full realization, as much as we could understand it, of what the body was like. Because I think sometimes we get this idea that Jesus' body was destroyed on the cross and somehow it got better when it was buried, or whatever. But that was one of those things that when I was preparing the sermon and really started to think about that, I thought they took a body down that was just crushed. It was just, you and I have probably never seen a body that, we may have seen bodies destroyed in, a car accident or something that might compare, but to be the one who had to handle that, or chose really to handle that, that was the biggest eye-opening thing to me, was to really get that impressed in my mind of what the body of Jesus was like. And then, tying it over into Mark 16 with the resurrection and then the appearances and those things, that body still bore a lot of those scars. We don't know how many, but we know he tells Thomas and John, about the nail prints and the wound in the side. So we don't know how many other wounds Jesus' body had, but I don't think it ever, quote unquote, fully healed in this life. And that's powerful to really think about.
Yeah, that he kept the scars. I've often thought about that, it seems like there were good reason for that, right? But, as far as if for no other reason to, for Thomas's sake, but that is interesting. So you conclude this sermon by talking about some foreshadowing and some things that are signifying of something that's going to happen later. And I love the fact that you point out that the tomb had a stone rolled in front of it, and you say that doors work two ways. They open and they close. Yes, I love that. They open and they close. Talk a little bit about the foreshadowing that we see when Jesus is placed in the tomb.
Yeah, the way we tackled that was, first of all, we talked about how, if you really stop and just kind of pause the narrative for a moment, you think about what different people or groups might have been thinking when Jesus was placed in the tomb. I probably remember all of them, but the Jewish leaders probably thought, we've taken care of the problem.
Yes.
The Romans probably think, we've taken care of this uprising, this tumult, and the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, is what matters. And Rome has been shown again that, we can take care of our problems. The apostles, I mean, can you put yourself in their shoes? I mean, they've given all this time. And now, I get it. They should understand this, but I wouldn't have either. Okay, let's just call it like it is. I wouldn't have gotten it either. We like to make fun of them. You're like, how in the world? I wouldn't have gotten it either. Okay,
no.
And it's no wonder Peter will say, "I'm going fishing. I'm going back to what I know."
And this is done.
Yeah. And then the other perspective I try to take was the view of hell. You go back to Genesis chapter 3. The devil probably thinks it's over. He's taking care of the plan of God. But Mark, as he ends this chapter, what we know is Mark 15, there are a couple, as you said, foreshadowing, just these word pictures, one of which is found in verse 46, the end of the verse. He rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. It doesn't just say the opening, but the entrance of the tomb. Well, where there's an entrance, there's an exit. If it just said, they rolled a stone over the front of the tomb or something, again, we know what's happened. We get it. But just that way of wording it, against the entrance of the tomb. Well, if you can get in, you can get out. And I love that Mark uses that terminology. And then at the end of the chapter, in verse 47, it talks about two of the women, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus. It says they saw where he was laid. And the word that Mark chose for saw there is the word from which we get our word theorized. Now, I get that they're just trying to remember because they're going to come back later to take care of the body. But by choosing that word, Mark is putting in our mind the idea that they really are thinking about this event, and what it causes us to want to do is see where this is going. And in the sermon, I mentioned that between Mark 15 and Mark 16 is the longest silence in all of history, because we want to know what's going to happen. Of course, we do, and praise God, we do, that Jesus came out of the tomb. But if there is no Mark 16, then everything falls apart. And so those little foreshadowings, those little language tools that Mark uses at the end of the chapter are just so exciting because it causes us to think, okay, if there's an entrance, there's an exit. And if they're seeing the tomb, then I want to go back and see the tomb and make sure that Jesus isn't there. And of course, in Mark 16, he's going to use the same word, Mark will, to see the place where they lay him. That's the same concept. So you can come in and think about this one now because he's not there.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about this at the beginning of the podcast, is that we often just kind of pass by the burial because we want to get to the resurrection. We focus a lot on the birth, especially this time of year. We focus a lot on the resurrection, especially during Easter, and just, because it is the linchpin of our faith. I mean, if he didn't rise from the dead, then what does this really matter? But we tend to gloss over or maybe just pass by the burial because, it's just a step along the way. But, you have helped me, and I'm sure your congregation see that was an important step. The death on the cross, taking him down from the cross, embalming him the way that they did, placing him in the tomb. There's a little book, and I can't remember who wrote it. I read it a long time ago, called "Who Moved the Stone." I don't know if you remember that book.
Yeah.
And it's written as a skeptic would, like for this person, it was a huge thing that stone was moved, because nobody could have moved that. No human could have moved that. And I think it's very important to zero in on the burial and just exactly what that means, the implications of it, right? You want to say more about that? I mean, you've really brought that to light. I appreciate that.
Well, if nothing else, one of the things to point out when you think about the burial is that's how someone becomes a Christian too. It's the death, we're buried in water. We're, buried to rise, to walk in newness of life. And so, we often have that, you'll see those charts of, Jesus on the cross, and then a burial, and then a resurrection. And on the other side of a chart might be a person going down to water. And it's just a reminder of, we are beautifully recreating what Jesus went through. And Jesus really did die. That really was his body in the tomb. And so when I go down into the waters of baptism, I really am dying, not physically, but I really am putting something, or to use more biblical terminology, someone, an old person, an old man of sin, to death. And so just having even that concept in our minds is really important, because we love to talk about, buried in water. Well, we're buried like Jesus was buried. And so having that connection makes baptism even that much more beautiful to us.
Yeah, I can imagine that these thoughts were helpful, or will be helpful going forward when it comes to our focus on communion, the Lord's Supper. There's, obviously a lot of meditation that should go on, and that does go on during that time, but thinking about the burial, thinking about, all that means and all that signifies, and that wasn't the end, right? I mean, that the story continues. If that were the end, then there's no reason really for us to be talking about this, or for you to and I to preach the gospel or anything, because that's it. He's wormed her. But I think the fact that wasn't the punctuation point is really a big, lesson to get from this as well, right?
Yeah, when I preached the sermon, near the end, I said something like, "Spoiler alert, something did happen." So I want you to come back next Sunday and be reminded of that. But I'll go ahead and spoil the story here. Yes, he comes, up from the grave, he arose, and praise God that he did.
Absolutely. Adam, we talked about it at the beginning of this episode. Your blog, the things that you're doing there with the Central Church. We like to highlight the good. Tell our folks how they can keep in touch with you, how they can keep up with what you're doing, all the things, all the platforms you're using. Just now's your time to do a commercial.
All right. Well, the main hub of the stuff our family does, you can just go to faughnfamily.com. That's where all the blogs and podcasts and things come from. Or if you like the podcast that Leah and I do, it's called A Legacy of Faith. We produce that every once in a while. We always get to the bi-weekly podcast. It comes out 7 times a year. We do whenever we can. My wife, Leah, is also doing a YouTube channel, Bible Study for Ladies, at Leah Faughn. You can follow her there. We're just all over the place. I guess the best place to go is find me on Facebook, because we link to everything from there. And so that's probably the best place to go.
Well, and you will be blessed by doing so. I love all the stuff that you're doing, and I appreciate you being on today and taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. And, and I know you're blessed to work with Noah. Noah went through our preacher training camp for many years when I was in Abilene. Loved Noah to death, and glad that he's there with you to learn from you.
He has been an absolute blessing. He and Allison are just, they fit in here like a hand in a glove, and they're doing tremendous work for us.
That's awesome. Look forward to being with you next summer, and appreciate everyone for tuning in today. If you have a question about today's episode, you can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. If you have a specific question about today's episode or for Adam, we will forward that to him. I'm sure he'd be willing to answer any questions that you might have. He'd love to hear the nice comments that you have as well. Just appreciate everyone tuning in. And Adam, just appreciate you again. Thank you.
Oh, glad to do it. Thanks for having me.
And thank you guys. Once again, until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.